My name is Celeste. I am 38 years old, and I never thought the person who would humiliate me most completely would be the same person who used to share a bedroom with me growing up. But that is exactly what happened. My sister Fiona and her husband Mark had been married for 10 years. A decade of holidays together, Sunday dinners, birthday calls, the ordinary texture of family life. I had been present for most of it, loyal, consistent, the kind of sister who showed up early and stayed late. I spent 3 weeks finding the perfect anniversary gift for them. Not cheap, not careless. Meaningful. The kind of thing you choose when you actually know the people you are giving it to. I wrapped it carefully, imagined Fiona's face when she opened it, and felt the quiet satisfaction of having done something right. I never imagined what she was already planning to do with it. Thank you for listening to my story of betrayal, resilience, and justice. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you on your commute, taking a break at work, or cozy at home? Share it in the comments so we can connect and swap stories like this together. If this story pulled you in, don't forget to subscribe, give it a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next real-life drama. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation and the justice going. Fiona called me 4 days before the anniversary dinner. Her voice was warm, easy. The voice she used when she had already decided something and was presenting it as a suggestion. "Why don't I pick up the gift from you this week?" she said. "I can keep it at the house and make it a proper surprise for Mark. He'll love that it came from both of us. You know how he gets about things being planned." I hesitated for exactly 1 second. Fiona and I had always been close enough that 1 second of hesitation felt like an overreaction. She was my sister. She was offering to help. There was no obvious reason to read anything into a simple, practical offer. So I said yes. She came by 2 days later, picked up the wrapped gift with both hands, smiled at me in the doorway, and left. The smile stayed in my memory afterward. Not because it was warm, but because it lasted just a half second longer than it needed to. The receipt arrived in my email the following morning. Fiona had forwarded it, explaining she had exchanged the item for something Mark would prefer, and attached the new receipt as a record for me. I opened it while drinking my morning coffee and read through it without any particular alarm, until the total at the bottom stopped me. The number was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Meaningfully wrong. The gift I had purchased had cost $420. The receipt Fiona had sent me showed $280. I put my coffee mug down. I went back to my own email, found my original purchase confirmation, and held both numbers in my mind at the same time. $140 difference. I sat with it for a long moment, turning it over, looking for the innocent explanation. A sale, a different version, a simple error in the forwarding. None of those explanations fit the numbers. My stomach had started doing something quiet and uncomfortable. I decided not to call her. That was the first conscious choice I made in what would become a much longer series of choices, and I think it was the right one. Calling Fiona in that moment would have given her the opportunity to explain, to smooth, to produce a story that filled the gap just enough to make me feel unreasonable for pushing further. I had known Fiona my entire life. I knew how she handled being caught off guard. She didn't panic, she pivoted. She was good at it. Warm, quick, plausible. It was one of the things I had always admired about her in other contexts. So instead of calling, I watched. I paid attention at the next family gathering, a casual Sunday lunch at our parents' house, in a way I never had before. I watched Fiona move through the room, watched her hands, watched the small choices she made about where to stand and who to talk to. Halfway through the afternoon, I saw her reach into her bag, glance quickly around the room, and slide a small piece of paper into her coat pocket. It was a receipt. My receipt. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and went back through everything carefully. My original purchase confirmation. The forwarded receipt from Fiona. My bank statement showing the full amount charged to my card on the day I bought the gift. I pulled up the store's website and looked at the item number on Fiona's forwarded receipt. It didn't match the item I had purchased. The store code in the header was slightly different. 1 digit off, the kind of difference that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The receipt was not from an exchange. It had been created to look like one. I kept going. I checked the email headers on the forwarded message, something I had never thought to do before. The sending address was one letter different from the store's actual domain, a private address designed to mimic the real one. I sat back in my chair. Fiona hadn't just kept the difference. She had built a small, deliberate system to cover it, which meant this was not a moment of impulse. This was something she had thought about. I needed to know how much further it went. It took me the better part of a week to build the full picture. I requested a copy of my original transaction from the store directly, which confirmed the item had never been exchanged or returned. I printed it. I took screenshots of the email headers and the mismatched item codes. I pulled my bank statement and highlighted the original charge. Then, because something in me needed to know the shape of what I was dealing with, I looked more carefully at the past 2 years of transactions connected to gifts I had given Fiona or contributed to on her behalf. There were 3 other instances where receipts hadn't matched. Smaller amounts, $60 here, $90 there, the kind of discrepancies that could each be individually dismissed as errors if you weren't looking at them together. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to mistake. I organized everything into a folder. Printed copies, digital backups, timestamps on everything. I also noticed during this process that Mark had sent me a text 3 days earlier, brief, casual, asking whether I had heard anything about the gift being exchanged. He had phrased it carefully, like someone who didn't want to alarm anyone. He was asking questions too. The anniversary dinner was 12 days away. In the time between my discovery and the dinner, I had 3 interactions with Fiona that I now experienced completely differently than I would have before. A phone call where she chatted easily about the dinner plans, the restaurant she had chosen, how happy Mark was going to be. A group family message where she referenced the gift warmly, saying Mark was going to love what we got him. As though we had chosen it together. As though my money and her involvement had been a genuine collaboration. At family gatherings, Fiona had always been the one people gravitated toward, quick with a story, generous with her attention, the kind of person who made a room feel warmer simply by being in it. I had always been proud of her for that. Now I watched her work a room and saw the mechanics of it differently. The warmth was real. I still believe that. But beneath it was a careful management of what people believed about her. A friend pulled me aside quietly at one gathering and said, "That receipt she mentioned, the numbers seemed off to me too." Am I crazy? Fiona was standing 6 feet away. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes moved. I chose the anniversary dinner deliberately, not because I wanted drama. I want to be clear about that. I had no interest in a public scene for its own sake. But the dinner was the moment Fiona had chosen. She was the one who had planned the reveal of the gift, who had told me she wanted to make it special in front of everyone. She had constructed the stage herself. All I was going to do was let the truth be present on it. I confirmed my attendance. I said nothing to Fiona that deviated from normal. I texted the right things, responded to the group chat, asked what time to arrive. Then, 3 days before the dinner, I reached out to Mark. I kept the message short. I told him I thought there might be some confusion about the gift, and that I wanted to make sure everything was accurate before the dinner. I told him I had some paperwork he might want to see. He replied within the hour. "I had a feeling," he wrote. "I'll be there early." I arrived at the restaurant 40 minutes before anyone else. It was a quiet Italian place that Fiona had chosen. Small, warm, candlelit, the kind of room that felt designed for intimate celebrations. Round tables with white cloths, soft music that stayed comfortably in the background, the smell of something good coming from the kitchen. Mark was already there when I arrived, sitting at the bar with a glass of water, still in his coat. He looked up when I walked in with the kind of relief that people show when they have been waiting for something uncomfortable to become official. We sat together at a corner table, and I showed him everything. The original receipt, the forwarded fake, the email headers, the bank statement, the pattern across the previous transactions. He went through each page carefully and quietly. When he finished, he set the papers down on the table and sat with his hands flat in front of him for a moment. "How long?" he asked. "At least 2 years that I can document," I said. He nodded once, slowly. Fiona arrived 20 minutes later. Her smile when she saw us both already seated together was the first sign that something in her had shifted. It arrived a fraction late and sat slightly uneasily on her face. The other guests arrived in small groups over the next 20 minutes. I watched Fiona move through the arrivals with her usual ease, hugging people, directing them to seats, filling the room with the warmth she was genuinely good at producing. She had dressed beautifully. The table was arranged with small touches she had clearly planned. She had put real effort into the evening, which made the whole thing more complicated and also more sad. I had placed the sealed envelope containing my documentation on the table in front of me, casually, like it was nothing in particular. Fiona noticed it. I saw her eyes travel to it briefly as she passed, then away, then back again in a second less casual pass. She couldn't read anything from the outside of it. Just a plain white envelope, slightly thick. She picked up a menu and handed it to me with a bright smile. Her hand, I noticed, had the faintest tremor in it. She knew something was different about tonight. She didn't yet know what. Dinner conversation moved easily through the first course. I participated normally, answered questions, laughed at the right moments, ate my soup. Nothing about my behavior gave anything away, and I was deliberate about that. I was not cold or stiff or pointed. I was simply myself. At one point, during a gap in conversation, I mentioned the gift casually, said I had spent a while choosing it, that I had wanted it to be something genuinely personal rather than just practical. A friend named Audrey, sitting across from me, looked up with mild surprise. Wait, I thought from what Fiona said it was something smaller? I don't mean that badly, just. It wasn't small, I said simply, without any sharpness in my voice. Fiona reached for her water glass. Audrey looked between us with the polite uncertainty of someone who has accidentally stepped into the edge of something and isn't sure how far it goes. Fiona laughed lightly. Oh, you know how these things get mixed up in the telling. But the laugh was 3 beats too bright. Mark had been quiet through most of dinner. Not conspicuously quiet. He was engaged, responsive, present. But I had spent enough time around Mark over 10 years to know the difference between his relaxed quiet and his thinking quiet. This was the latter. He listened to everything, responded to what was directly addressed to him, and periodically glanced at Fiona with an expression that she wasn't reading correctly because she was too busy managing the room. Toward the end of the main course, he leaned toward me slightly. Should we do this before or after dessert? He asked under his breath. After the gift reveal, I said quietly. Let her set the stage. He nodded. Fiona caught the exchange from 2 seats away. She couldn't have heard the words, but she saw the lean, the low voices, the mutual nod. Her smile, when it returned to her face, was doing more work than usual. She reached over and touched Mark's hand warmly, a public gesture of connection, the kind that doubles as a small claim of territory. Mark smiled back at her, but his eyes, behind the smile, were already somewhere else. After the plates were cleared, Fiona stood and announced it was time for the gift. She did it beautifully. She told a short story about the past 10 years, a few well-chosen memories, the right amount of warmth, a joke that made everyone laugh. She was a genuinely gifted speaker in small rooms like this one, and watching her work, I felt the complicated grief of someone who loves a person and is simultaneously about to expose them. She presented the gift to Mark with both hands, explaining how she and I had chosen it together, how much thought had gone into it. Mark turned it over in his hands, listening to her describe it. Then he looked at me. I slid the envelope gently across the table toward him, natural, unhurried, as though it were simply a card to accompany the gift. The warranty information, I said calmly, and a few other documents that go with it. Fiona's eyes went to the envelope. Her description of the gift, mid-sentence, slowed. Mark opened the envelope without rushing. Fiona kept talking. She filled the pause with additional detail about the gift, her voice maintaining its warmth while her eyes tracked every movement of Mark's hands on the papers inside the envelope. She was performing. I could see the effort of it now in a way that I couldn't have seen before I knew what I knew. Every gesture was deliberate, every sentence constructed. She was working very hard to keep the room's attention on her voice rather than on what her husband was reading. At one point she misspoke, said the name of a different store entirely, not the store on either receipt, and then corrected herself quickly with a small laugh. I had documented the actual store name in 3 separate places in the envelope. Mark paused for a half-second at the papers and then continued reading without looking up. One of our mutual friends, a woman named Petra who had known us both since childhood, tilted her head slightly, and looked at Fiona with an expression that asked a question without words. Mark set the papers down on the table in front of him, face up. "Can you read the warranty code at the top?" I asked, keeping my voice easy, conversational, the tone of someone making a routine request. Fiona's sentence stopped. There was a small moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where the room recalibrated. Not dramatically. Just the slight shift of attention that happens when something changes register without announcing itself. Mark read the code aloud. Then he looked at the forwarded receipt Fiona had sent me, which was in the envelope alongside the original documentation. He read the item number from that receipt. The two codes were not the same. He set both papers down side by side on the white tablecloth so they were visible to the people nearest him, not theatrically, simply practically, the way you place two things next to each other when you want to compare them clearly. Fiona reached forward. "That's probably just a formatting difference. The store codes are in a standardized format," Mark said quietly. "They don't vary." Fiona's hand hovered over the papers for a moment, and then withdrew. The table had gone to a particular kind of quiet, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of people who were paying close attention while pretending to be doing something else. Someone picked up a water glass. Someone else straightened a napkin. Mark turned to the bank statement in the envelope. He looked at the original charge, $420 on my card on the purchase date. He looked at the amount shown on Fiona's forwarded receipt. He did the arithmetic visibly, without a calculator, because it was not complicated arithmetic. "There's a $140 difference," he said. Still calm. Still the quiet, factual tone of a man working through a document rather than a confrontation. Fiona said, "It must be a mistake somewhere. These things happen with online receipts all the time." Her voice was steady. I gave her that. But the words themselves were thin, and everyone at that table could feel it. "The email header on the forwarded receipt," I said gently, "shows a private sending address, not the store's domain." The table went fully still. Fiona turned to me. For a moment, just a moment, the performance dropped. Not completely, not permanently, but enough that I saw the real thing underneath it. Not anger, not yet. Something more like the expression of a person who has run a calculation and arrived at an answer they don't like. Then it came back up. The composure returned, and with it the explanation. "I think there's been a genuine mix-up," she said, looking around the table rather than at me. "These online systems are so complicated. Receipts go through third parties. The formatting changes." "Fiona," Mark said. Just her name. Nothing after it. She stopped. He wasn't looking at her with anger. He was looking at her with something quieter and more final, the expression of a person who has arrived at a conclusion they had been resisting and has now stopped resisting it. I said nothing. I had said what needed to be said. The documents had said the rest. The room did not need me to perform anything further. The truth was already present, and it was doing its own work, steadily and without any assistance from my emotions. I reached into the envelope and placed the last documents on the table. The bank statements covering the previous 2 years. 3 additional transactions, highlighted in yellow, each one showing a discrepancy between what I had contributed and what Fiona had documented. Not large amounts individually. Together, a clear and consistent pattern. I had not planned a speech for this moment. I didn't narrate the documents or explain them line by line. I simply laid them on the table and let people look. The table went completely silent. Audrey, sitting across from me, leaned forward slightly, read the top statement, and sat back. Petra looked at Fiona with an expression I recognized, the specific look of someone revising a long-held opinion in real time. Fiona's face had gone pale in the way that has nothing to do with lighting, and everything to do with what is happening inside a person's chest. One of the other guests said very quietly, almost to herself, "Is this real?" No one answered her because the answer was already visible on every page on the table. Mark closed his eyes briefly. It was a small gesture, lasting less than 2 seconds, but it carried everything that could not be put into words at a table surrounded by people who had come for an anniversary dinner and found something else entirely. When he opened them, his jaw was set in the particular way that very controlled people hold themselves when they are containing something large. I felt, I want to be honest about this, something I had not expected. not triumph. Something more like grief, moving quietly alongside the vindication. Because Mark was a good person. Because 10 years was a long time. Because the thing being dismantled at this table was not just Fiona's deception, it was something larger, and several people in this room were going to feel the weight of it long after tonight. Fiona looked at me. The anger arrived in her eyes first, fast, hot, instinctive, and then almost immediately behind it came something else. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like the beginning of shame. She opened her mouth, closed it. The friends at the table began to process what they had read. Quietly, in the way that people process things in public when they don't want to make the moment larger than it already is. Audrey asked a careful question. Had this been happening regularly? Was it just the one transaction? And I answered factually without embellishment, pointing to the highlighted lines on the statements. Petra turned to Fiona and said, in a voice that was not unkind but was entirely without its usual warmth, Fiona, how long has this been going on? Fiona looked at Petra. At Audrey. Around the table. She began to explain. Stress, a difficult financial period. She had always intended to return it. She hadn't meant for it to become a pattern. The words came out in the right order, but the logic inside them was hollow, and the table could feel it. Petra nodded slowly through the explanation, the nod of someone listening fully and believing almost nothing. Someone else at the table said quietly, she noticed things years ago and never said anything. Everyone understood who she was. Fiona's eyes moved quickly around the room, recalculating who knew what. When there was a pause in Fiona's explanation, I spoke. Still calm. Still the same even tone I had maintained all evening. I wasn't upset about the money, I said. Not primarily. The amounts. I could have absorbed them. What I couldn't absorb was the system. The fake receipt. The email address designed to look like the store's. The pattern across 2 years. I paused. That's not a mistake. That's a decision. Made more than once. Fiona looked at me. You called my money our gift, I continued. You stood up tonight and told this room a story about how we chose something together as sisters. And the gift you were describing was bought entirely with money you had already partially taken from me. The room was very still. You were spending my money, I said. And calling me cheap in the process. Fiona's mouth opened. For a long moment, nothing came out. Then, barely above a whisper, I know. 2 words. And they were the first completely true thing she had said all evening. After I spoke, the dinner did not recover. Not in a dramatic way. No one raised their voice. No dishes were broken. No one stormed out. It dissolved, the way celebrations dissolve when the thing holding them together is no longer present. People finished their drink slowly. Conversations became careful and brief. Chairs scraped back from the table in ones and twos as people found reasons to leave. Early mornings, babysitters, long drives. Petra squeezed my hand on her way out. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Fiona sat at the table for a long time after most people had gone, not speaking, not reaching for her phone. Mark sat beside her, but there was a quality to the space between them that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. I collected my documents from the table, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it into my bag. Fiona's phone buzzed on the table in front of her. She looked at the screen and something in her face changed. Another thread pulled, I suspected. Something else she had not expected to surface tonight. 3 weeks passed before Fiona and I spoke properly. In that time, she had returned what she could. The amounts that could be practically settled, she settled. A transfer to my account with no message attached. Just a number that was close but not quite exact, which I think was the best she could manage at that point. The anniversary dinner had become a story that moved quietly through our social circle, not loudly, not cruelly, just present. Her social media, which had been active and carefully curated, went quiet. No posts. No updates. The particular silence of someone who has lost confidence in the story they were telling. I heard from Audrey that Fiona had called her the week after the dinner. That the conversation had been long and honest and difficult in ways Fiona apparently hadn't anticipated. That she had cried, not the performing kind of crying, Audrey said, but the kind that comes when a person actually sees themselves clearly for the first time in a while. I didn't take satisfaction in that. I just noted it and let it be what it was. She came to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon. I made tea. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table, which felt appropriately ordinary for a conversation that needed to be plain. She looked different than she had at the dinner. Quieter. The performance was gone, not because she had decided to drop it, but because she seemed genuinely tired of holding it up. "Why didn't you come to me first?" she asked. "Before the dinner. Why did you have to do it in front of everyone?" I thought about that for a moment before answering. "Because you built the stage," I said. "You were the one who planned the reveal. You were the one who decided to stand up in front of that room and tell a story about what we had done together." I kept my voice even. I just made sure the full story was in the room. She was quiet for a long time. "I told myself it was small enough not to matter," she said finally. "I know," I said. "And then it wasn't small anymore." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." She looked at her hands. "You never asked," she said. "If I was struggling." "You never asked." I held that for a moment. "You never told me," I said gently. "You just took. And then built a performance around it." She nodded. Slowly. Without argument. Driving home from Fiona's house a month later, we had begun the careful, slow work of rebuilding something between us, neither of us pretending it was quick or simple. I thought about what I had learned. Not about Fiona. About myself. I had spent years being the reliable one. The quiet one. The sister who showed up and gave generously and asked for very little in return, partly because I genuinely didn't need much and partly because I had told myself that was just who I was. What I understood now was that generosity without honesty is not actually kindness. It is a performance of a different kind, the performance of someone who would rather be seen as good than be known as real. I had let things go unchallenged for years because saying something felt like disruption. What I discovered at that dinner table, watching the documents speak for themselves while I stayed calm, was that the truth doesn't need protection or performance. It just needs to be present. I had played the long game. Not out of strategy, but out of patience, waiting until I had the full picture, until the moment was right, until I could walk into a room with everything I needed and let it speak without raising my voice. That, I had learned, was where real power lived. Not in anger, not in volume, in evidence, in timing, and in the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are carrying.